Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz. Brandis Friedman is on assignment. On the show tonight.
Public safety is just frankly in jeopardy. Justice is in jeopardy.
High-profile resignations raise questions about why the Cook County State's Attorney's Office is losing prosecutors. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi riles up Beijing and possibly the White House with her visit to Taiwan. What could be done to prevent the spread of monkeypox in Cook County Jail after its first confirmed case? As rental prices rise, so too does the number of tenant unions, why several organizations are calling for the state to lift rent control bans. An internship with the Nature Conservancy connects teen environmentalists with the Illinois prairie.
Medicine and medications and disease are complicated.
And a local pharmacist hopes to uncomplicate those topics by offering prescriptions with an extra dose of cultural understanding. And famous disasters reimagined on canvas. Meet a Chicago artist inspired by history and catastrophe. But first, some of today's top stories. Backlash is building against the Republican nominee for Illinois Governor Darren Bailey for comparing abortion to the Holocaust. The recently unearthed comments were live streamed on Facebook in 2017 when Bailey ran successfully for the Illinois House.
I believe that abortion is one of the greatest atrocities of our day, and I believe it's one of the greatest atrocities probably forever. The attempted extermination of the Jews of World War II, it doesn't even compare on a shadow of the life that has been lost and with abortion since its legalization.
And Bailey is facing incumbent Governor J.B. Pritzker, who is Jewish, in the November election. Pritzker denounced the comparison today, tweeting in part, quote, "To equate the Holocaust to a woman's right to choose is not only disturbing, but it's also disqualifying." The teen that was seen on video being punched by Oak Lawn police is being released to his family. 17-year-old Hadi Abuatala, seen walking out of the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center with a walker, was supposed to appear at a detention hearing for a felony weapons charge, resisting arrest, and cannabis possession. But the Cook County State's Attorney's Office asked to postpone the hearing to review whether prosecutors will move forward with the prosecution. The teen's lawyers call the officer's actions extreme and excessive and have filed a federal lawsuit alleging his civil rights were violated.
He was released today. The State Attorney's Office is doing their due diligence and checking to see if they're going to go forward with this case, as I respect their decision to do so. We stand with Hadi. We stand against police brutality. We stand against all the injustices that the police do to citizens of this country and this county. So we stand with Hadi to the very end, and we pray for a positive result, and we pray for his health and well-being.
An Illinois congressman joins House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in Taiwan. Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy, seen on the far right, and other U.S. politicians defied Chinese threats by making the trip. China condemned the visit as a threat to peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and responded by conducting military exercises. The speaker and her delegation say the visit shows how strong the American commitment is to Taiwan. And we'll have more on this visit coming up just a bit in the program. But up next, a mass exodus at the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, so please stay with us.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Since COVID, lots of people have changed their jobs and their outlook on work. But the Cook County State's Attorney's Office is seeing a degree of turnover that's raising alarms among the criminal justice community. Amanda Vinicky joins us now with more. Amanda.
Yeah, Paris, we've all heard about that shift, come to be known as the Great Resignation. And Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx's office has previously blamed that for the dwindling pool of local prosecutors. But Dan Kirk says assistant state's attorneys, or ASAs as they're known, leaving in droves isn't normal, even Great Resignation normal.
And anybody who says otherwise is simply trying to create an alternate narrative because they don't want to admit the plain truth, which is that people just can't tolerate working there anymore if it doesn't match their vision of justice. And quite frankly, exposing the population of Cook County to dangerous criminals who every reasonable person agrees should not be allowed to walk the streets should not comport with anybody's sense of integrity and morals and ethics. And that's why I'm not surprised that all these people are leaving in the numbers that they are.
Now, Kirk was the top assistant state's attorney under Fox's predecessor, Anita Alvarez, whom Foxx bested in the 2016 primary. Prior to that, he had worked as a prosecutor in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office under Dick Devine. And Kirk says his comments are not sour grapes. Rather, he says he knows how things are supposed to go. It is a challenging job, but he says he's in touch with current ASAs who are frustrated about how things are going under Foxx, frustrations that have drawn public attention when a long-serving assistant state's attorney, James Murphy, recently resigned and blasted Foxx on his way out, writing, "I can no longer work for this administration. I have zero confidence in their leadership." Murphy went on to write to colleagues that while he believes that people shouldn't be in jail just because they can't afford bail, he disagrees with Foxx's role in what he says was a rushed recent state law that does eliminate cash bail while making other major changes to the criminal justice system. Now, Murphy says that the Foxx regime that is focused on PR stunts and isn't living up to promises of focusing on prosecuting crimes and also isn't supporting ASAs who are in the courtroom trenches. Now, his ado also references low staffing levels that he says are at dangerous levels. We could not reach Murphy, but Kirk says there should be about 3 ASAs per courtroom to handle the hundreds of cases that go through. And when it dips below that, he says that's a problem.
You see supervisors within the state's attorney's office sending out desperate pleas for people to volunteer on days off or not take vacation because they're understaffed and public safety is just frankly in jeopardy. Justice is in jeopardy. Even justice for those who are accused of the crime. You need an adequately staffed state's attorney's office to do justice, both for the accused, for the victims of crime, and frankly, in the interest of public safety for all of us that live here and want to live in a safe community.
Kirk says that Murphy's public condemnation of Foxx is courageous, given her role in what he calls the modern Democratic Cook County machine. Now, Murphy is not the only one to leave recently, though, with that letter and his long tenure is getting a lot of attention. You did have yesterday another supervisor and longtime assistant state's attorney, Ted Lagerwal, resigning. Now, the Chicago Tribune also reporting last month about how Foxx's office is struggling to keep up with waves of exiting attorneys. But Foxx has defenders, and they say people can leave and are doing so these jobs for any number of reasons. We have a source close to the state's attorney's office who sent along a resignation letter from one ASA who wrote she regretted having to move on, but her family was moving out of state. The source also sent along a letter from another high-profile supervisor who left earlier this year. That was Chief of the Criminal Division, Natasha Toller. She resigned in February. Toller's letter also does make reference to the pandemic-era staffing shortages that she called significant. But Toller in that letter also giving a shout out to Foxx, thanking her for trusting her with a promotion. We did reach out to Foxx's office multiple times, seeking an interview, a statement, answers to specific questions. And just before showtime, we got some back saying that they are actively working to recruit more and have made significant strides in legal hiring. Here, by the way, is a photo of Foxx swearing in a new class of ASAs back in November of 2021. Foxx's office says that in January of 2020, the office, so pre-pandemic, had 770 ASAs and now is only slightly below that with 749. In a statement saying that while the CCSAO, like other frontline employers across the nation, has not been spared in the departure of talented employees, we are committed to supporting our dedicated attorneys and staff who are faced with doing more with less, particularly in these challenging times. We recognize the rigors of this difficult work and the toll that it bears, yet over 1,100 employees show up every day to work on the front lines and behind the scenes, and a testament of the resiliency and spirit of this office as we seek justice on behalf of the people of Cook County. Now, by the way, Kirk again and other critics not buying it. Foxx did come under a lot of scrutiny during her bid for a second term 2 years ago, but she easily won re-election. If she does run again, she'll be up in 2024. Paris, back to you.
Thanks, Amanda. U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi landed in the island nation of Taiwan earlier today, causing predictable backlash among leaders in mainland China, as well as China's ambassador to the U.S.
We will take whatever we can to respond and to protect, to safeguard our sovereignty, territorial integrity. And our response will be very firm, strong, and forceful.
The House Speaker's visit has also drawn praise, notably from several Republicans who take a tough stance against China and say it is consistent with U.S. support for the island nation. And joining us is Craig Kafura, a foreign policy specialist at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, with a particular focus on the U.S.-China relationship, and Tom Ginsberg, professor of international law at the University of Chicago. We did also invite a representative from the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office here in Chicago to join us, but they declined, instead referring us to a message posted by the Taiwanese ambassador, noting that Taiwan has welcomed members of the U.S. Congress for decades, and the U.S. and Taiwan's, quote, shared values and common interests in democracy, human rights, peace, and prosperity. And we are glad that the two of you are here. Craig Kafura, remind us why Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan is seen as so provocative to the Chinese.
So the Taiwanese statement is accurate. It does accurately describe that the United States and Taiwan do have a close but unofficial relationship. What makes Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan particularly upsetting for China is partly due to the timing. So this August comes right around the anniversary day for the People's Liberation Army. It comes just before the Chinese leadership's annual retreat where they gather and discuss issues. And it comes just a couple months prior to the 20th Party Congress in China, where Xi Jinping will seek a third term of power to continue to stay in office. All of these factors mean that there's a lot of pressure inside China for that strong response the Chinese ambassador mentioned.
So it could complicate politics in mainland China. Tom Ginsberg, how does the international community view Taiwan? Is it as a legal state entity or as the Chinese view it, as a breakaway province?
Well, it's interesting. Both the governments of China and Taiwan formally claim to be the rightful government of the entire country. Now, of course, for several decades, that's been a complete fiction from the angle of Taipei. But as a formal matter, they both claim to be the legitimate government of the whole country. And so that means that the international community is stuck between recognizing one or the other as the legitimate representative. The United States and the United Nations switched their recognition in the 1970s. There's still a handful of countries that recognize Taiwan as the legitimate Republic of China. So, but for the most part, the international community has followed the United States in having informal relationships with Taipei, but formally recognizing the People's Republic as the sole legitimate government.
And Craig Kafura, you mentioned that there might be political pressure in China for a strong response. What do you think that response might look like?
So we've started to see some of that response already. It started last night with a series of economic restrictions placed on Taiwanese food exporters to mainland China. We've also seen announcements today about a number of live-fire military exercises that the PLA is going to conduct in the waters around Taiwan. Some of those live-fire zones will overlap with Taiwanese territorial waters, which is a new feature for this sort of response. And we've also seen cyber attacks occurring against Taiwanese computer networks. Now, these are probably not the only responses we're likely to see out of China, but those other responses will occur over the next couple of weeks.
And Tom, Craig mentioned that it's a politically tricky time for China. What do you see as the purpose of Pelosi going there at this moment in time, strategically for the U.S.?
For the life of me, I can't understand it at all. The executive branch is elected to execute our foreign policy. Congress is an independent branch, and so she can do what she likes. But the timing seems to me not in the American interest. The fact is Xi Jinping is going to be in power for decades. And we need to have relationships with him on many, many, many matters. And so a political stunt that goes against what the executive branch wants to do is something I can't understand or fathom, and I don't think is a wise move myself.
So perhaps maybe no strategic interest here for the U.S. at this moment for her doing this. Craig Kafura, does this complicate efforts between the Biden administration and China, particularly on issues like support for Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war?
I doubt it's going to make their lives any easier. And I think that's why when this trip was first announced, re-announced for August, you saw some pushback from the Biden administration, some notes that the administration officials were not particularly happy with Pelosi for her timing of this trip. That said, I'm not sure that this is going to be the make or break issue in Chinese cooperation when it comes to Russia. Their partnership, as they've noted, is quite strong. They have their own rationales for doing it. And although Chinese officials will often like to link these issues in public, it's not clear that that follows through in private conversation.
Tom, how do you think that this complicates the relationship between the U.S. and China in a very fraught moment, obviously?
Yes, I think it does complicate it. Again, we need China on many, many matters. And so I think the response, which Craig referred to, so far has been about Taiwan itself, but eventually will be about the United States. And, you know, memories are very long in that part of the world. This won't be forgotten, and it will have consequences down the road. Again, I can't understand the collateral gain. Some members of Congress get political benefit from doing things like this. But Nancy Pelosi's district in San Francisco is, you know, a very anti-China district. But that said, she's the Speaker of the House. She is, in some sense, representing the whole country when she goes somewhere. And, you know, that's something you'd want coordination and support from the executive branch, whoever was in that office.
Perhaps she's getting some mileage in her own district, which, as you mentioned, has a heavy Asian American population. Craig Kafura, do you view possible retaliation not just against Taiwan, as you mentioned, but as Tom is saying, eventually against the United States? And could that be some kind of escalating military conflict?
I don't know that I would expect China to escalate militarily directly with the United States, but you might see China take a harder line in other areas of interest to the United States. So, for example, perhaps China will advance previously postponed measures in the South China Sea, maybe basing military planes on some of these islands that they have reclaimed, perhaps announcing an air defense zone in the South China Sea. There are other areas where China could make America's life difficult beyond just immediately around Taiwan.
And Tom, I mean, the backdrop of this is fears that China would invade Taiwan, much like Russia did Ukraine, and try to reclaim it. What are the realistic possibilities of that happening in the near-term future?
I don't think it's a near-term possibility. In fact, I think the Ukraine invasion bought Taiwan quite a few years. And that's because of the sanctions, the economic sanctions, which the world put up against Russia. China's currency is not yet, you know, convertible widely, and I don't think they're quite ready to absorb all of the sanctions. But they, now seeing what's happened, are going to be planning with all that in mind. And, you know, that does remain their stated goal, is to take the island back one way or the other.
All right, very complicated geopolitics here. And our thanks to Craig Kafura and Tom Ginsburg for making sense of it for us. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yep.
There are now 533 confirmed monkeypox cases in Illinois, and one of those cases was confirmed last week in Cook County Jail. So what can be done to prevent the spread of the virus that is now considered a public health emergency in the state? Joining us with more are Amanda Klonsky, Research and Policy Fellow at the COVID Behind Bars Data Project at the University of California, Los Angeles Law School, and Dr. Emily Landon, Executive Medical Director for Infection Prevention and Control at UChicago Medicine. We also reached out to Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart's office. They did not have a representative available to join us tonight, but we do thank the two of you for being back here. First of all, Dr. Landon, what does the governor's emergency declaration as it relates to monkeypox mean in practicality for the fight to contain it here in Illinois?
You know, these kinds of declarations are really important for focusing a light on something that is really affecting the citizens of Illinois. And so we get spots on TV like we're having right now, and more people may pay attention. But more importantly, it also gives access to funding that can help open up opportunities for additional contact tracing, additional public health, additional vaccine, additional sort of all of the things that are needed to help people cope with this sort of a problem are easier to do once we have a public health emergency declaration.
And Amanda Klonsky, we mentioned that one reported case in Cook County Jail. How concerned are you about monkeypox spreading, given what you have observed and what we've seen at Cook County Jail and jails across the country with COVID?
I'm very concerned. The crowded and inhumane conditions inside of jails and prisons have served as taxpayer-funded incubators for COVID and have intensified the spread of COVID for the last 2.5 years. So we've seen that these conditions are really a threat to public health, not only for people inside of the jail, but in the community at large, especially for people of color and Black and Latinx people who are particularly impacted by over-policing and are overrepresented in the jail.
And Dr. Landon, how might monkeypox spread in tight community settings like a jail? And Cook County mentioned that they believe the person that had it in Cook County Jail had it before they went into custody, and they've isolated that person.
Yeah, so monkeypox and COVID are really different. One, COVID is spread mostly through the air that we breathe and that we share with other people. Monkeypox is a lot more about direct skin-to-skin contact, especially with lesions. There's a little bit of an issue with respiratory droplets, but it's more like mono, like you kissing someone, sharing cups with them. It can contaminate your bed sheets and your clothes, but it's not as likely to contaminate the whole air around you, which makes it a little bit more of an opportunity. It's a little better for us to be able to control it in these tight quarters and jails, but there's still a lot of things that are going to have to change in order for people living that close together to be able to avoid giving one another monkeypox. I'm confident that we can find a way to be able to do that. The biggest opportunity that we have is that monkeypox takes about 14 days, 8 to 14 days to develop after an exposure. And so you can use vaccination after an exposure to help prevent people from getting sick, which would be a great option in a situation where someone comes into a jail setting and then develops monkeypox that they picked up outside of the jail, keeping it from spreading inside the jail. But right now, we just don't have enough doses of the monkeypox vaccine to be able to promise that everyone's going to be able to get one.
All right, availability of the vaccine right now is the big issue. Amanda, we saw the initial rash of COVID cases in Cook County Jail. They kind of got that under control, but we see a huge spread of the Omicron BA.5 variant now. What is the situation there and in jails in general right now?
So with the rapid spread of the B5 COVID variant, jails are once again the sites of large outbreaks across the United States. And unfortunately, a lot of this is happening outside of the public view because so many jail and prison systems across the United States have ceased all COVID data reporting. And so as of July 26th, the Cook County Jail reports 41 active cases among jailed people and 75 cases among staff. And we have to remember that at least 10 detained people and 7 members of the Cook County Jail staff have died of COVID so far. So COVID is not over. And we know that the conditions inside of the jail amplify the spread of viruses. Those conditions have to be addressed. And whether it's through the mitigation tactics that Dr. Landon has shared with us, or by reducing the number of people behind bars, which experts have said for 2.5 years is the most effective strategy to prevent mass outbreaks of COVID and other infectious viruses, right? In these crowded conditions, people are living in 6 by 6 foot cells, sometimes with 2 or 3 people in a bunk. So this idea that we can prevent close contact is really mythological.
So Amanda, that was going to be my follow-up question. With the spread of this variant right now, should the jail reduce the population like it did in the beginning, and they focused on those charged with misdemeanors, those that had health issues, and those that they generally deemed would not be a threat to the community? Is that an approach that would be warranted now?
We have to decarcerate. We can't rely on jails to make us safe. They're in fact a threat to public safety, right? The most effective strategies for controlling outbreaks in jails and prisons are to reduce the number of people behind bars, because crowded conditions behind bars create the conditions in which these viruses can easily spread. And it's not just monkeypox. Monkeypox is the scary virus of the moment. But people who work in the jail regularly get staph infections, MRSA, and other viruses that spread quickly and easily, both because of close contact and because of close contact with laundry. Imagine being a person right now who's being paid very little to collect the laundry and sheets of people who may or may not be infected with this virus. So this advice to decarcerate has largely been swept under the rug by courts and elected officials here and elsewhere. And as a result of that, millions of preventable COVID cases and tens of thousands of deaths across the United States have been driven by prison and jail-linked spread of that virus. And we can't let that happen again.
And Dr. Landon, this variant is spreading rapidly. The president had it recently. Governor Pritzker had it recently. Seems like everyone we know. I had it recently. It seems like we're not talking about it the way we've talked about past variants. Why is that?
This is a big mistake. The new variant is causing more hospitalizations and more serious illness. The BA.5 variant has driven the numbers of individuals in our hospital at the University of Chicago tripled 1 week and doubled again the next week. And that's the last 2 weeks. We are seeing more patients now in the hospital than we've had since February. And we are certainly having issues with staffing, as every hospital is seeing that same sort of increase. And I just don't understand why, when we have high transmission and all sorts of problems, we just can't get together and make the decision that we're going to wear masks in places where people need to be that are, non-elective, grocery stores, pharmacies, libraries, the DMV. There's no need for a trip to the grocery store to result in a virus that can, in the worst case, result in someone's death, which for most of us isn't going to happen. And that's the truth. But there is long COVID. There's also unknown long-term effects of COVID that we're just starting to understand more about. I'm not willing to take on that level of risk in order to pick up my groceries. And I don't think that other people really would be if they understood as much about the virology as I do.
All right. Well, a lot to keep our minds on. Our thanks to Amanda Klonsky and Dr. Emily Landon. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
And up next, a painter turning historic tragedies into inspiration for his art. So please stay with us.
Much of the story of Latinos in America is that of entrepreneurship. About 5 million Latino-owned businesses currently exist in the U.S.
Predominantly Latino communities often bear the environmental burden of heavy industry. Residents of those communities say they have a hard time making their concerns heard.
A Chicago-based photographer has a personal understanding of immigration, and he has spent years documenting small businesses.
The forces of gentrification can make people being priced out of their neighborhoods feel powerless. But the founders of Lolita's Bodega say residents have more power than they think.
A word of warning, our next story contains images that are as frightening as they are fascinating. A Chicago artist paints accurate historical depictions of terrifying tragedies, fires and tornadoes, and nautical disasters that took place in Chicago and elsewhere. Producer Mark Vitale met a painter inspired by history and catastrophe.
A railway disaster in Ohio in 1867, a circus fire in Connecticut in 1944, and the sinking of the Lady Elgin in Lake Michigan in 1860. These depictions of calamity were made by local artist Eric Edward Esper, whose work has been featured on WTTW's Chicago Stories. Here's his recreation of the Iroquois Theater fire of 1903. It makes sense that his work ended up on PBS.
I originally became interested in history from reading war history, which is very, disastrous itself. And then I became interested in historical disasters from watching documentaries on Channel 11, WTTW. The first one was the Eastland disaster, which inspired me to make a painting of it, and I painted that, and it sold right away, and I decided that'd be a good body of work to continue with.
They range from well-known, the Loop L train derailment in 1977, to lesser-known, the 1909 Chicago water crib fire, which took place 2 miles offshore. There's an emphasis on the Midwest. For instance, the 1896 tornado that struck downtown St. Louis, and the firestorm in Peshtico, Wisconsin, that occurred the same day as the Great Chicago Fire, which Esper has also painted.
These are all references from different angles.
Long before he applies oil paint to canvas, he does his homework.
A lot of research, yeah. I watch as much information on TV I can find, lots of internet searches for photographs, lots of that. And I read 2 or 3 books if I can find that many on the event. That's important to me to try and get the details right. It takes a long time, 6 months to a year per painting usually.
Esper works as an art installer in River North at Gallery Victor, which also represents him. When he moved to Chicago from Michigan, he was a landscape painter. His paintings are often done from a bird's eye point of view.
My objective was to show as much as I could, to not just zoom in on one portion of this. I like to capture the whole scene, to put it into perspective. And the bird's eye view has that kind of, early American illustration quality to it.
Sometimes he paints landscapes of places related to notorious moments. This is the Spahn Ranch in California, headquarters to Charles Manson and his family. And here is the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. Other dark days depicted in Chicago history include the fire at Our Lady of the Angels and the ill-fated Flight 191.
I always try and keep it a little tasteful without trying to depict death. It's more of realizing that's happening than it is depicting it. A lot of things have inspired me to paint these. I used to do antique poster restoration, so I was into this old illustration posters. Then I got into the history from watching documentaries, and inspired me to paint these most dramatic scenes I could imagine. You know, it's not a sunny day at the beach in any of these, so I thought it was an interesting story that behind every one of these incidents that would draw people in to think a little bit more about what they're looking at. You know, it's something to try to remember.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Mark Vitale.
Again, the artist is Eric Edward Esper, and you can see more of his work on our website. And still to come on Chicago Tonight, tenants in Chicago push to end a ban on rent control as rental prices skyrocket across the city. An internship with the Nature Conservancy connects teen environmentalists with the Illinois prairie. We share the details.
Medicine and medications and disease are complicated.
And how a local pharmacist is helping immigrant communities better understand the American healthcare system. But first, some more of today's top stories. More delays in the racketeering case against former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan and his longtime co-defendant Mike McLean. A judge has granted the defense teams an extension through February to review the massive amount of evidence submitted by prosecutors. The next status hearing is set for January 9th. It looks like Chicago Cubs fans can finally exhale. The Cubs did not trade all-stars and fan favorites Wilson Contreras and Ian Happ. How about that? The pair had prematurely said their goodbyes to teammates and fans before the Major League Baseball trade deadline today, but they're sticking around. One of Brookfield Zoo's most famous residents has died. Jojo, the zoo's 42-year-old silverback western lowland gorilla, suffered a fatal cardiac arrest during an emergency procedure this weekend. Jojo moved to Brookfield Zoo in 2012 as part of a breeding program for the critically endangered species. Jojo lived 10 years beyond the typical lifespan of a male gorilla in captivity. Rental prices are on the rise across the country and here in Chicago. According to the data firm CoStar Group, rent prices rose 9.4% in 2022. Now, local tenants are unionizing in hopes of pushing for an end to a rent control ban in Illinois. And here to talk about how tenants are fighting to stay in their neighborhoods and whether or not rent control is a solution are Jane Garvey, leader at the Chicago Creative Investors Association, Ben Avis, a member of the North Spalding Renters Association, John Bartlett, Executive Director of the Metropolitan Tenants Organization, and Michael Meany, Executive Vice President of the Chicagoland Apartment Association. Welcome all of you to Chicago Tonight. Ben, rents have shot up all over the city, but especially around Logan Square, the area that you're a part of. Give us a sample of what tenants are facing in your community.
Yeah, so a lot of our neighbors have received rent increases from Mark Fishman from about 15 to 20%, and that is a lot of money. You know, we have not received wage increases of that much, so it's been really difficult for people to make ends meet there. But luckily, through helping each other negotiate, we have seen the highest percentage rent increase has been only 9% after helping each other negotiate for that.
So you've been able to bring some of those rates down. Michael, there's a fair notice ordinance that forces landlords to give advance notice of increases. Are landlords across the city following those rules?
Yes, I think they are. And, you know, that was intended to provide a little bit more notice to tenants as opposed to the 30 days. There's either a 60-day or a 120-day notice. And so for situations where lease is not going to be renewed, then tenants do have that extra time to make other arrangements.
And Jane Garvey, landlords obviously perhaps face rising assessments, property values, taxes. Do they have no other choice but to pass those costs onto their renters?
I think most landlords operate based on supply and demand. You know, when you put an ad out there and get flooded with calls, it's kind of a choice of either raise the rent accordingly, so basically we're balancing. It's a balancing act. And yes, you do bring up a very good point. We're facing tremendous increases in costs on all fronts. We're also facing tremendous increases in risk. We've seen that the government can shut down our income and not take away the costs. And that has scared a lot of owners out of the market. It's also decreased the supply of at least smaller units, the things that people can sell to owner occupants or can move into themselves or can turn into condos.
So a lot of different market forces at play here right now. John Bartlett, how successful have these tenants organizations been? You heard Ben talk about how they were able to get some of those rent increases down. How successful are these unions?
I think that when tenants form unions, they tend to be successful, at least to negotiate some reduced rent. Unfortunately, most tenants are not part of a tenants union and don't even think to negotiate, so then they end up paying higher rent than they need to.
Ben Avis, how did this tenants organization come together?
We started organizing at the March 2020 when the pandemic hit. Our founding member, Kat, lost their job at a restaurant and were afraid they weren't going to be able to pay rent. So they went around with a petition to their neighbors who they figured were in the same situation and started talking to each other and presented a petition to Fishman to offer some relief on rent, which was ignored out of hand, but we were able to get a free month's rent for about a dozen tenants. And since then, we've kept together and organized and increased our numbers a little bit and gotten some more material gains with each other.
And Michael Meany, one of the things that these organizations want to do is lift the statewide ban on rent control, which has been in place for upwards of 25 years. It's a perennial debate here in Chicago. Is that a good solution for the times that we're in right now?
No, we believe that it's not a good solution, and it has proven to not work in markets where it has been tried. Most recently, rent control was enacted or at least approved by voter referendum in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and already we have seen a precipitous drop in the number of building permits in St. Paul in particular by 61%. So as we have said before, when you enact rent control in markets, it tends to have the opposite effect of trying to keep rents low by driving investors out of the market, reducing supply and pushing upward pressure on rents. And one thing I'd like to mention, I know that obviously every community, every neighborhood is different, but with regard to the rent increases that we're seeing now, we have to remember that, as Jane mentioned, during the pandemic, we went through a long period where rents did not rise at all. In fact, in some instances, rents were either reduced or heavy incentives were provided, 1, 2, 3 months rent. So when we look at these year-over-year increases, we have to remember that last year was a little bit unusual because rents had not increased during the pandemic at all.
And of course, there was a eviction moratorium in place for a long period of time. John Bartlett, what about that? Rent control, the perennial legislative fight here, is that something that you believe the General Assembly should pass and the governor should sign?
I certainly do. I think it's one of the many tools that we need to start reducing rents. I mean, rents right now are far too high. 20% of all renters are paying half of their income to rent. And that is just unsustainable. And we can't keep putting that pressure on renters to think that, that they'll be okay, because they're not. And we know that evictions are a problem. They are a problem in many different communities. And the reason there are so many evictions is because rents are too high. So I really think we need to do that along with other, it's not the only solution, but that is one of them.
Jane Garvey, what about from your perspective? Is this going to be tough on landlords, on building owners if rent control is enacted in certain portions of the city?
It certainly will be, and I think it's already being tough on tenants because with continual drumbeat of we need rent control, owners, and particularly the things that are affecting everyone, owners are going, okay, I need to be at market because they're only going to allow a certain percentage over what I'm at now. So the owners that have left somebody's rent stable or very, for a long period of time are looking at it and going, I'm charging $900. The market's at $1,700. I need to get my rent up closer to $1,700 or I won't ever be able to bring it back to market. So that's been an issue. The other issue is the real solution here is more supply. There are many, many, many ways of getting more supply, and causing a disincentive to people to provide housing is counterproductive for everyone.
Ben Avis, what about that from your perspective? Is just building more supply of units, more affordable housing, a better way to go?
That would definitely be a start to the solution, but ultimately we believe in direct politics, and we understand that we as tenants are the ones who provide landlords with the money that makes them able to operate, and that allows them to influence things like legislation that could be implemented to lower housing rates. And if rent control truly, made rent prices higher, we wouldn't see landlords fighting against that. So ultimately, we want to concentrate our own economic power to keep housing affordable and ultimately to take control over the distribution of housing so that it can be rationally distributed to everybody, regardless of how much money they have.
And Michael Meany, from your perspective with the Apartment Association, if rent control is not the solution, what is the solution in your mind?
Well, as we mentioned, it is a supply and demand issue, and we need to build more housing. The National Apartment Association and the National Multifamily Housing Association just issued a report that indicates that Chicago needs upwards of 30,000 units over the next 10 years, and that's just in the larger buildings in order to meet demand. We're encouraged, and we worked with all of the groups represented on this call here, with the General Assembly to pass an omnibus housing bill last year that we think is going to help spur development and maintenance of affordable and market rate housing. In particular, there's a provision that provides a property tax incentive for owners, investors to provide affordable housing in all of their market rate developments. And we think that that's going to go a long way towards helping to meet the affordable housing challenge that we face.
All right, very crucial issue here. And our thanks to Jane Garvey, Ben Avis, John Bartlett, and Michael Meany for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And up next, connecting teen environmentalists with the Illinois prairie. That's in a conversation that first aired on Chicago Tonight, Black Voices. But first, we take a look at the weather.
As brutal heat waves sweep across the globe this month, calls to address the effects of climate change have become increasingly urgent. But in addition to large-scale policy efforts, making lasting change often starts with individuals. The Nature Conservancy's Youth Environmental Thinkers program is hoping to be part of that change. The program is a paid internship that helps 16 to 18-year-olds explore Illinois' natural environment as well as the sociological impacts of climate change. So joining us now are Deborah Williams, Community Engagement Specialist with the Nature Conservancy, and Danielle Brogan, an intern with the Youth Environmental Thinkers program. Thanks to you both for joining us. Deborah Williams, let's start with you, please. How did this program come about?
Well, as a community engagement specialist and with the desire to impact the community where I serve, which is Markham, Illinois, which is the prairie capital of the Prairie State, I developed this program with help and input from colleagues so that we could address the balance when it comes to people and nature. And of course, it's not just reaching out to teen environmentalists, it's reaching out to teens who some don't even like nature, but the impact of the program allows for experiences where we look at how to address climate change environmentally and sociologically.
Danielle Brogan, describe sort of a typical day in the field for an intern.
So a lot of our days we spent doing research or learning about how different parts of nature affect people nowadays, as well as every Thursday we would go out with the stewardship team and we were allowed to help out in the prairie, whether that be catching bugs or pulling weeds. It was really just in order to get us out into nature as well.
Did you consider yourself an environmentalist before coming to this program, Danielle?
Well, I was in theory. I had always cared about the environment and thought about how I could help, but the being outside aspect, I did not know I would enjoy as much as I did.
Deborah, why do you believe it's important for young people to be engaged in this kind of work?
Well, I just believe that young people need to be engaged as they learn about themselves and others, and then to be informed about what climate change is, yes, environmentally, but also how we engage with people. Because often we want to get the work done that is connected to nature and the environment, but don't necessarily address people climates and how we relate one to another, and how, in even trying to talk about the environment, you can't do it with pulling people in like a noose around their necks, but being respectful about the people even as you address the nature. And young people and how they engage in their variety, in the variety of atmospheres that they are in, that is not an either or, but a both and.
Danielle, what was it that made you interested in this program?
Well, my high school chemistry teacher recommended it to me, and next year I am majoring in chemistry with a minor in both environmental studies and communications, which environmental studies relates back to the nature aspect. However, communications relates to the people aspect of the program.
Okay, so obviously you've taken something that you've gotten from this internship, and it sounds like you're thinking about applying it in your college studies by adding the communications.
Oh, of course. What Ms. Williams has taught me about interacting with other people has really just helped me really connect and be able to learn and have respectful dialogues with others.
Deborah, you've mentioned, one of the goals of the program's proclamation is connecting people to people and people to nature. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, because of my experience thus far, just since 2015, with the whole thing with conservation and caring for the earth, I found that often there was the intrigue of nature, the trees and the birds, which is warranted. But how I relate to somebody who's right next to me, that wasn't necessarily something that was championed. And so whereas somebody may see a rare bird and be all excited, realizing that the person that you have the opportunity to connect with on a daily basis or once is also very rare and very valuable, and trying to bring a lens towards looking at it in a balanced way, and both benefit.
Deborah, also explain, if you would, the importance of getting teens involved in learning about, sort of nature, and how much does, climate change and the impact of climate change come into that learning?
Well, I will go back. It's not necessarily, the program wasn't designed just to get teens involved in the effort, but it was an economic piece that was connected there. And as I talked about learning about themselves as well, it's sometimes the first job for some of the young people. So work ethic, responsibility, independent functioning. But if you don't know, and many of we had 5 interns this year, several of them were like, they learned something they didn't know. But now that they know about it, they can address it and even want to pass it on in such a way where they feel knowledgeable because they've experienced it. So teens have a voice and teens have impact and influence. So it just so happened that our program focuses on 16 to 18-year-olds, and they know somebody, and their somebodies know somebody. And so it gives the opportunity to expand the message of balancing the people and nature aspect and connecting people to people and people to nature, which means just really paying attention to what you experience outside and what you experience when you're in your different people climates, intentionally.
So, Danielle, you've told us what you plan on studying in school, and you've mentioned that you're going to Monmouth College in the fall coming up, so congratulations there. How do you see this program sort of helping your professional goals later on?
Well, really just being able to further interest myself in nature and the environment, as well as once I do get to a professional level, being able to open a conversation about climate change and have it be a mutual learning experience as opposed to something where there's someone blaming the other, which is not what we want, as Ms. Williams taught me.
Deborah, this week was the last field day for the program. Are there other opportunities for engagement in the future?
Actually, yes. We've been intentional about wanting to stay connected. And like August 20th, we're having a Prairie Day in the area that's around Paintbrush Prairie, which is again in Markham and where our office is. And then on October 1st, we're having the All of Nature Festival. It's a tripartite now, actually four groups are partnered at the Midlothian Meadows.
All
and
right.
it will be
Sounds like a lot of
very
fun.
active.
Sorry
It
to jump
is.
in. Best of luck to you, Danielle Brogan and Deborah Williams. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Back with more Chicago Tonight right after this.
When it comes to health care, clear communication is critical to good outcomes. In the West Lawn community, a first-generation Mexican-American pharmacist is trying to bridge a communication gap by adding a dose of trust and understanding to his patients' prescriptions. Producer Erica Gunderson has the story.
I try to get here a little early because this is a very busy store. Prescriptions start rolling in either online or on the phone.
At the 63rd and Pulaski CVS, a steady stream of patients arrive at the pharmacy counter from open to close.
My team here is fantastic. Most of them are also Spanish speakers. They'll fill 600 plus prescriptions a day. I will work with them to fill the prescriptions, verify the prescriptions, and then serve our patients when they come here. Often, especially when they come in and they start trying to speak with us and they hear that we can speak Spanish with them, I hear relief.
To CVS pharmacist Cristobal Alvarez, pharmacists are more than people who dispense your prescriptions. They're healthcare's most accessible ambassadors.
If you have a question and it's during the day, you can walk into a pharmacy and ask to speak with a pharmacist. You can't really walk into a doctor's office and ask to speak with a nurse or speak with a doctor. We can explain and speak with them in ways that maybe a doctor at a clinic might not have the time to.
Alvarez says his path to the pharmacy began as a child, when he was often called upon to act as a translator between Spanish-speaking family members and English-speaking healthcare providers.
My grandma, for example, diabetic, not, a word that they could share with the doctor. So it was my job, even as a child, to try to translate that.
And in communities like West Lawn, Alvarez says communicating with healthcare providers often means speaking not only the same language, but also the same culture.
I see a lot of Mexican Americans or recent immigrants who could really use that support to kind of help them navigate. How do I buy a prescription? In Mexico, you feel like you're getting a cough, you walk to a pharmacy, you ask them for an antibiotic, they hand it to you. You can't do that here. Not too long ago, we had someone that happened with like an anti-seizure medication. Here in the United States, they can't come in and just grab a seizure medication off the back of the shelf.
CVS Health's Dr. Stephanie White says Alvarez's experiences behind the counter reflect the drugstore giant's research into how Latino Chicagoans prefer to interact with healthcare providers.
If we look at how communities of color kind of responded among our non-white Chicagoans when they're selecting their most trusted healthcare providers, 31% select providers who understand and relate to their culture. And 39% were selecting providers who understand their lifestyle and environmental factors that impact their health. And when it pertained to things like routine care for illnesses or injuries, more than a quarter of our non-white Chicago respondents rely on their local pharmacies, more than twice that of white respondents.
Alvarez says even when they can't be of direct help, the pharmacy team tries to be a resource for their patients.
If someone comes in here with an open wound, I'm not going to be able to stitch them up, but I can tell them, hey, like that needs medical attention. I need you to go to the doctor's office right now. And so from there, I'm like, well, we'll have to find you a clinic.
That one does need a refill from the doctor's office.
And when it comes to healthcare conversations, a strong dose of trust is often just what the doctor ordered.
Medications and disease are complicated. It's why it's so important to be able to speak with people in a way that they're comfortable with. And, you know, that culturally affirming healthcare is so vital.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Erica Gunderson.
And CVS is offering free community health events in the coming weeks. You'll find details on our website. And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that's our show for this Tuesday night. Please join us tomorrow night live at 7. Ghost buses, trains, crime and low ridership. We speak with CTA President Dorval Carter about these issues on the CTA and more. And the old Morton Salt Shed is now Chicago's newest music venue. We'll get a backstage tour. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and enjoy this evening.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm, and proud sponsor of programming that offers